Schneid guy.
So now we're going to talk about cardiac conduction velocity. Conduction velocity is the speed at which an electrical impulse spreads through the heart in this context. The major determinants are the fiber diameter, and we saw some examples of this. The left bundle branch is thicker than the right bundle branch. It has a bigger diameter, and so it does conduct a little bit faster than the right bundle branch, and therefore the left ventricle depolarizes a little bit before the right ventricle does. Another example is the AV node. The AV node cells are small, and that is one reason why they have a slow conduction, and there is a slowing of the impulse from the atria to the ventricle. There's a couple of examples of the fiber diameter. The phase zero slope and amplitude is the electrophysiological property that also determines the conduction velocity. And that is why it's so important to know what kind of ionic current is involved in the phase zero. And remember, the phase zero also is where the type of action potential gets its name, fast response versus slow response. Let's take a look at some interventions that can affect the conduction velocity. The clinically relevant locations for conduction velocity are going to be the AV node and the ventricle. That is really where you want to be thinking about conduction velocity and how it can change. The L-type calcium channels are involved in AV node conduction because these are slow response fibers. They depend on calcium current for phase zero. And so the AV node is affected by autonomic nervous system input from the parasympathetic and sympathetic divisions. As a refresher, the M2 receptor is coupled to GI. It decreases cyclic AMP, and that ultimately has an effect to decrease protein kinase A and consequently conduction velocity. The sympathetic nervous system utilizes beta 1s, which are coupled to GS. They increase cyclic AMP. They help activate pKa, and that increases conduction velocity. And there's also various drugs, as you could imagine, that can affect muscarinic receptors, beta 1 receptors, L-type calcium channels, either directly or indirectly through other types of drug mechanisms. If we look at the ventricles, they're going to be dependent on voltage-gated sodium channels because these are fast response fibers. They depend on sodium channels and sodium current for phase zero. And there are drugs that can block voltage-gated sodium channels and decrease conduction velocity through the ventricle. And there's also conditions that can increase the inactivation of voltage-gated sodium channels like hyperkalemia, and that also can decrease conduction velocity. Notice what's absent here is the effects of the autonomic nervous system. There is no effect of parasympathetic or sympathetic on the voltage-gated sodium channels and conduction through the ventricle. I want to make sure that you see that distinction.